In this final lesson, talking about the concept of actus reus and mens rea for an offence, we're going to talk about the idea of strict liability offences. These are going to be important because we're going to come across them at multiple points in our series here on criminal law. We're also going to come across them at multiple points in an upcoming series that we're going to do on road traffic law as well. And ultimately, they are important in the sense that we need to identify how strict liability operates before we can then apply it to specific offences. So, for example, there are certain strict liability offences that exist within the Sexual Offences Act, which we'll get to, of course, in future lessons' time. But ultimately, like I've said, this is a final lesson on the nature of criminal liability, as well as the core components of a crime. We're going to move on from this in the next lesson and start talking about participation in criminal activity, specifically, i.e. parties to a crime. We're going to talk about the circumstances where the mens rea for an offence is not necessary for a conviction of a defendant. This refers to the implications for strict liability. Now, a crime which is of strict liability is one where there is an actus reus for the offence, but it does not necessarily have attached to it a mens rea element. That is the distinction that we have. For the most part, criminal offences require there being an actus reus and a coincidence to that with the mens rea. There has to be a coincidence of actus reus and mens rea. But with strict liability, there does not necessarily have to have this attached mens rea element. They are almost entirely found today in statutory provisions. So for the vast majority of cases where we're talking about strict liability, they are no longer common law offences. They are, for the most part, for statutory offences. It also means that, whereas with non-strict liability offences, the prosecution must show that the defendant had a prerequisite mens rea, either through intent, recklessness, or negligence. With strict liability, on the other hand, there is no such requirement for the necessary to be necessary for the defendant to be found guilty. So let's think about how strict liability operates, because it has been a difficult position for the courts to essentially try and do without mens rea and to establish a strict liability through the wording of a piece of statutory provision, because the default position is that for the courts to maintain an assumption of mens rea. And so it means that the basic position that is required is that mens rea be necessary, and that it is a requirement for strict liability to be found for the displacement of the assumption of mens rea. And this requires a number of stages. So the way in which we find strict liability is therefore where we assume mens rea ultimately at the beginning of the process, and then owing to certain circumstances we may be able to displace the mens rea assumption to establish a strict liability offence. Now these requirements are set out in the case of Gamon and the Attorney General of Hong Kong from 1985. The facts of this case are as follows. It involves a number of defendants who were all involved in the construction of a building in Hong Kong, and the construction ultimately will be done where we see a deviation, or a quote substantial deviation, from the approved plan on the construction itself. And so as a result of that, the construction of the building the building itself, should I say, would ultimately collapse as a result of the fact that there was a substantial deviation in the approval from the approved plans. Now, for reference, for those of you who want to know specifically, the charge of substantial deviation from the approved plans, which leads to the collapsing of the building, was contrary to Section 42AB and Section 42BB of the Hong Kong Building Ordinance. That's for the most part, you probably wouldn't need to know that. But I've added that in there just for a specific citation. Now, the defendants argued that they had no knowledge that they were deviating from the approved plan, and they were deviating so much that this would fall into the category of substantially deviating, and therefore enter into the realm of deviation from the law, and violation of the law, essentially, deviating from the Hong Kong Building Ordinance. Now, it was ultimately held by the Privy Council on appeal that there was no need to show the mens rea for the defendants to be convicted. So even though the argument on the part of the defendants was, we had no knowledge of this, we had no mens rea of this offence, therefore we cannot be convicted on a basis because there has to be mens rea, the appeal said, no, in fact, it is not the case that that is a requirement. In fact, there is no need to show mens rea for this particular offence. This is a strict liability offence. And then upon that was the determination of the court, of the Privy Council, but then on doing so, they also wanted to set out the key stages for making determinations as to the nature of strict liability. And so there are two main requirements. The first requirement is to ultimately begin all proceedings by assuming that mens rea exists. So if you have a statutory provision, if you have a building ordinance, or if you have something that is passed by Parliament or delegated legislation or whatever, that is creating an offence, it is creating a criminal offence, okay? And the question of whether or not from the wording of the legislation, this criminal offence requires mens rea, the courts begin by assuming just from the basis that there is mens rea. There is a presumption of mens rea, okay? So to show criminal liability, you have to negate the presumption of mens rea in showing so. So just like stated earlier, this is the default position of a court. The default position of the court is that the mens rea for an offence is required, and then it is up to the prosecution to show that the defendant had the necessary mens rea for the conviction of the offence. And so to find strict liability, this has to be displaced. There has to be a displacement of the presumption of mens rea. It must be necessary as an implication from the reading of the specific provision. And the nature of this presumption may also change depending on the offence being charged. So you will have the fact that, for example, minor offences will likely have the carrying of a strict liability attachment compared to more serious offences. Okay, so that's the first question that we have to ask. We have to firstly assume mens rea exists and presume that we have a mens rea requirement for this offence. And so the next question is, how is it displaced? Well, when we displace mens rea and we get the imposition of strict liability, it has to be effective to promote the objects of the statute by encouraging greater vigilance to prevent the commission of the prohibited act. And this is the requirement for mens rea in that regard. So we will get back to strict liability in future, but this is the test that is required. You have to first presume mens rea exists, and only displace mens rea if it is effective to promote the objects of the statute by encouraging greater vigilance to prevent the commission of the prohibited act. Okay, that's the two-stage test for establishing strict liability. And like I've said, we will get back to this in future lessons when we actually apply strict liability offences themselves.